you go.
Okay. Well, my name is Alexander B., which is my middle initial, and the B stands for my former name, Polish name, namely Biały Włos, Bialywlos, which means white hair. And my second name is White, where I have cut the hair off, and that's my name now, Alexander B. White. I was born in 1923 in a small town, which you may call a shtetl, in southern Poland, which used to be Galicia under the Austro-Hungarian Empire prior and during World War I. Later, when Poland got its independence, it became Poland. So I was born in Poland, whereas my parents were born in what used to be Austria. We were a family of 6. My father, Mendel was his first name, Biały Włos, was born in a shtetl not far from my own town of Krosno. My mother was born in Krosno, I assume, and they were married around 1920 or 1921. I had a sister who was the oldest, and she was about a year and a half older than I. I had 2 brothers, one, Solomon, or Shlomo as we called him, and he was about a year or a year and a half younger than I. And I had a little brother called Henik, H-E-N-I-E-K, the Hebrew name being Chaim Hirsch, after my grandfather on my mother's side, and he was born in 1931. I still remember his birth as the midwife delivered him and his cry, and I can still smell the fish that was served during his bris. My father, when he married my mother, was taken into my grandfather's business, which was the glass business, plate glass, glazing, glass, beveling, framing, mirror making, etc. And he had learned that trade on the job from my grandfather and from my uncle, my mother's brother, Joseph. Now, Joseph and my father then became partners in the business. My father had only 20%, and Uncle Joseph had 80% of the business. The business did quite well, so well that they were able to purchase the largest building in our town, which was a 3-story building. And as I remember it, having browsed through records before the war, which my grandfather kept nicely wrapped around, I remember that they paid about $33,000 about in 1931 or 1932 for that building. They later purchased also a warehouse at the railroad station where glass could be delivered straight from the train getting to the warehouse. They were renting out half of the warehouse to a big firm, and they kept half of the warehouse for the glass business. We lived in the center of town, and our shop was just in front of where we lived. We lived in only 2 rooms with my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side. And we additionally had a room in our new building on the 3rd floor where 2 of us kids stayed because we were short of space. Now, my grandfather on my father's side was a cobbler, and he was a widower, his wife having been killed by a shrapnel during World War I. And my father, for all practical purposes, grew up at the house of the rabbi of that town called Dombrova. And he was a very famous scholarly rabbi. And of course, when he married my mother, he moved to Krosno. Now, as a youngster, we spoke mostly Yiddish at home rather than Polish. So that when time came for me to enter public school, my mother decided that maybe I should get in a year before the mandatory age of 7 so that I can learn a little Polish, because I will probably not pass. So they petitioned the director of school, Mr. Jagiełło was his name, to allow me to enter school at the age of 6, which he did. They thought I would probably have to stay over a year, but they were surprised or disappointed that I passed the 1st grade and therefore was the youngest in school. I remember that I could recite the teacher's verses by heart, even so I didn't know what it meant. After one single reading, my grandmother, Mala, who lived with us, thought that I had what she called an eisernen Kopf, that means a iron head, and that I will probably be the greatest rabbi in Poland, because already at the age of 3 or 4, I could recite the prayers by heart, I could do all kinds of things, and she was amazed. My cousins who survived the war in Siberia tell my wife that if Grandmother Mala were alive today, she would be ready to go right back into her grave, seeing me not eating kosher, having married my wife, who, according to Jewish law, is not Jewish because her mother wasn't Jewish, and so on. Anyway, I attended Cheder, which is a Jewish Hebrew school, at around the age of 3 to 4. And of course later, the public school. Now, in the Cheder, we were there all day. The Benfer, which was the helper to the teacher, which we called the Malamed, or rabbi, he would pick us up at home and he would lead us to the Cheder. And there we would be all day long. The rabbis used to have sticks, and they used to beat you if you didn't know your lesson by Friday, especially the Bible lesson by that Friday. Also, they did all kinds of other things, other indignities to a kid that did not behave or didn't learn his lesson, such as, for example, they would take the hat of the rabbi's grandmother with a feather in it, stick it on the head of that student who's only about 4 years old, put some dress on him, put him on the stove, and the other kids were to walk by and shame him. And that's the way it used to be. Now, other rabbis, later on, when we got older, used other modes of punishment. Some hit you over the shoulder, another one hit you in the face, another one would have you bent over and give you a few sticks on your behind, and that's the way it was in those days. Now, in public school, Polish school, of course, things were not like that. Although we had one teacher, and she had you put out your hand, and with the lineal, she would hit you a few times in your hand if you did not know your lecture. Now, as far as the other kids in the Polish school, some of them were very unkind and very anti-Semitic, which they learned at home, because anti-Semitism in Poland was quite prevalent. Just to give you an example, a kid sitting next to me, I remember his name, Novak, would, for example, pass gas, then grab himself by his nose and say, "The Jew stinks." And all the kids would start moving away from me. I was beaten up a few times. And I took all these indignities in stride. I was afraid to go to the latrine during the intervals, because a kid would just turn around and pee on me. So I used to hold the urine until I got home. At one time, I remember I had to move my bowels, and I had to run home because I was afraid to go there to the toilet. And of course, I lost it all in my pants by the time I got home, even though we lived only within a few buildings from that school. So it was not a pleasant experience going to grade school. Later on, in a more advanced school, things were much better. Now, Jews in Eastern Europe were, for the most part, people with trades, such as tailors, shoemakers, hat makers, painters, glaziers, sheet metal workers, mechanics, and the like. And there were, of course, also professionals, lawyers, and physicians. Many of them educated abroad, because Poland had a numerus clausus, that means they would only admit so many Jews according to the percentage of Jews in Poland. So many did go out and study abroad. Also, they were exposed to all kinds of indignities. They were beaten up. They had to sit on separate benches, especially after Marshal Piłsudski, the leader of Polish independence, died in 1935. and anti-Semitism grew geometrically. So it was not a pleasant experience for any of us. Now, Jews in general lived with the Gentile population a peaceful coexistence, I would call it. There was little socializing other than business relationships. There were even some pogroms in Poland after 1935 and the death of Marshal Pilsudski. In 1938, as the winds of war came in, with Hitler in Germany having marched into the Rhineland, which he was not supposed to according to Versailles Treaty agreements, later marched into Austria, annexed it to the German Reich, and of course then decided to want the western part of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland, which he marched into and then marched further, taking all of Czechoslovakia. My family was discussing possibly leaving the country. And I remember my uncle Joseph, who was the partner in the business with my father, were discussing that maybe Uncle Joseph should go to the United States, where he had a member of his wife's family, survey the area to see whether we shouldn't emigrate. You should go to the World Trade Show in New York. My father objected to it, claiming that there in Poland, in our town in Krosno, we were considered well-to-do, by some people rich. And if we will come to the States, we will just be paupers. He felt we should stay where we were. And, of course, we did not leave. In 1939, after Hitler had already taken Czechoslovakia, in Romania, the king left and a fascist regime was established. Also in Slovakia, a nationalist regime was established. Hitler decided now to go after Poland. Just before that, the British and the French, called the Allies, made an agreement with Poland that in case Hitler should attack Poland, they will come to their assistance. Stalin would have also liked to come to the assistance, but Poland was afraid that once you let Stalin in there, he will never leave, and he will take over Poland altogether. So Poland resisted Hitler's demand that they cede Upper Silesia, which had a reasonable number of German ethnic people. They wanted to seize Polish Pomerania so that the Germans would have direct access from Germany to East Prussia. But Poland refused to do that. And as a result of it, September 1st, 1939, the German armies marched into Poland. Well, Poland started mobilizing its forces. The problem was that Poland was a relatively poor, mostly agrarian country. Germany was highly industrialized, and Hitler, since his ascent to power January 30th, 1933, had rearmed to the hilt against all the Versailles Treaty prohibitions and built up the most powerful army, navy, and air force in the world at the time. He was the only one who was willing, after World War I, a horrible war that was supposed to end all future wars, he was the only one that thought of another war, a Second World War, and was ready for it. The Allies, the French and the British, were not prepared. So when he marched in September 1st, 1939, he moved very rapidly eastward. His army was highly mechanized, whereas the Polish army was still on horses. And of course, you couldn't fight tanks with horses. The Polish armies fell back. They fought heroically, but against that onslaught, it was impossible for them to resist. The French and the British, instead of attacking Germany from the west, forcing a two-front war on Germany, were just sitting there and did nothing. They sat behind the Maginot Line, a defensive line that the French had built alongside the German border. And this was referred to as the phony war, because they were actually not fighting. Within about 17, 18 days, Poland was subdued. The German armies moved past the largest river of Poland, the Vistula, and went beyond the San and the Bug rivers, which was the future demarcation line between the Soviet part of Poland and the German part of Poland. Hitler had sent his foreign secretary, Ribbentrop, to Moscow only a few weeks before attacking Poland to make a deal with him, because he was afraid that Stalin might march into Poland and fight Hitler from the east. So he made an agreement whereby he would cede to Stalin half of Poland alongside the Bug and the San rivers, and he would also cede to them the Baltic countries, Bessarabia, Bukovina down in the south around Romania. And of course, Stalin agreed to it because he had got something for nothing. We did not know that there was such a secret agreement with them, and as the war started, people started escaping eastward, hoping that maybe the Polish army will stop the Germans at the Vistula River, and the Allies will attack from the west and will be able to go home, and Hitler will be kaput. But with him having the agreement with Stalin and the phony war in the West, this did not happen. My family started escaping rather late. My father was always extremely busy. He never had time for anything. He was busy in the business. My Uncle Joseph and his family managed to grab the last train out of our town and go eastward, all the way to the east, which was then taken over by the Soviets, which Hitler had seized to the Soviets. By the time we got to the train station was bombed, and there were no more trains going, so we came back home and we hired a Pole, Mr. Socha, S-O-C-H-A, who used to haul glass for us in the past. And he was going to take us eastward. Well, we just took whatever we could with us. We left our place open and had one uncle of ours who lived a little bit out of town move into our place to be more in the center of the city, which we felt would be safer. And we took off eastwards. Well, we didn't get very far because the roads were bombed. They were loaded with military traffic, refugee traffic. There was no way you could move any distance. We only got as far as a small town, shtetl, called Dynów, D-Y-N-O-W, near Przemyśl on the Sun River. When we got there, there were already many refugees there. We stayed at the president's of the Jewish community little house. We were sleeping on the floors, and there were loads of people there. And I remember my father lamented continually, "Oi, do I miss the bed? If I could only have my bed." We children did not mind it very much. We very rarely had ventured out of our town. And this was a sort of like a vacation. You slept on the floor. That wasn't bad. Things of that sort. Within a couple of days, the German army entered that little town. They came into the central square, set up their field kitchen there, and they were rather very nice. They looked very benign. People were walking around, and nothing was happening. They were handing out some candy, chocolate. Of course, we Jewish children didn't get in line for it because we were afraid that the Gentile kids will point us out to them as Jews. So we were afraid, but we watched from a distance, and they looked very, very benign. My father and a few other Jews from my hometown decided to go right back home because we had left everything open there. And my father told us that we should stay in Dynów, and he was going to go to a little tiny shtetl only a few kilometers away from my hometown, and there he will find out what goes on in our hometown, whether it's quiet or not, and if it's okay, he will send for us and we will go home. The day after he left, all hell broke loose in that town, Dynów. In that afternoon, the town crier went around and ordered all Jews between the ages of 16 and 60 to assemble in the central market square. And there was chaos. My mother took us children and put us around the table in the kitchen where we were staying and gave us books to read, sort of feigning that we do not know what goes on outside. We are busy studying. The man in the house ran down into the basement and put on his wife's clothes to be a woman. And all of a sudden, an SS-man in his black uniform, which we later on recognized as a Sonderkommando, which means a special command whose job was strictly to kill Jews and to kill Polish intellectuals and patriots. All of a sudden, he kicks the door open with his boot into the kitchen where we were sitting, with his revolver in his hand, and he said, "All men out." So my mother asked him, "What about him?" pointing at me, since I was the oldest male. I was 16 years old. So he asked, "How old is he?" And my mother told him that I was 14 years old. So he let me stay. But in the next room, there was a local kid, my age. Him he sent out. Well, we found out the following morning what happened to the people assembled in the central square. Early the following morning, around 5 or 6, it was still a little dark, there was a knock on the door to the house we were in. My mother went to open the door, and there was this kid who was sent out to the central square. He was bloodied, he was pale like a sheet, and described what happened. They took them out to a ravine just outside the town, and they lined them up along the ravine and started machine gunning them. When they started shooting, he dropped, having passed out. The dead were falling on him. And when they left, he came to and crawled out of the ravine and came back home. Within about half an hour, another gentleman knocked on the door, since we were right at the edge of the center of town. And this gentleman was from my hometown. His name was Shamroth. They had a bike store, and I used to rent bikes from him. And he had a bullet wound in his chest. And he was in that group and described the same thing. As the bullet hit him, he dropped. They took him for dead, and he came back. That very same evening, all of a sudden, we saw a huge fire through the window as the SS put the Jewish temple to the torch. Rumors had it the following day that they ordered some elderly Jews to go inside to take out the Torahs, the scriptures. And when they got in there, they locked the doors and put the place on fire. And they burned them. Now that's something that were rumors that I did not see. I saw the flames. It was horrible. It was scary. My father, of course, wasn't there because he had been returning home, luckily. About a day or two later, Mr. Socha came, and he had a letter from my father. And I remember my father described the ordeal of his and the few Jews with him on the way back to our hometown. Their beards were shorn, the monies were taken away from them, and I remember my father quoted a sentence from the Yom Kippur prayers, which went like this: Ishman de pura b'mamoine, v'ishman de pura b'nafshe. There are those that pay with their monies, and there are those that have to pay with their lives. And he paid with his money and not with his life. He told us that he is in Korchina, that little shtetl next to our town, only 5 kilometers away, which is about 3 miles away. And that in Krosno, in our town, things were very quiet. There was no killing, and that we should come back and we will go home. Well, we went back to Korchina. My father was there, and we all went home. When we came home and we started taking off our stuff from that horse-drawn wagon of Mr. Sochas, we heard that the Germans had ordered all Jews to leave the town and go eastward across the San River, the future demarcation line between the half of Poland given to the Soviets. So we started loading back our stuff. When, just as we were doing it, a Gestapo man by the name of Becker, there was already a Gestapo established within just a few days in our town, and they were right across the street from our shop and where we lived. A Gestapo man by the name of Becker comes down, and he says to my father, Herr Glasermeister, which means Master Glazier, you cannot leave. We need you here. You have to stay here. Well, we had the largest glazing establishment in our town. There was no other one. And, of course, the air base, the military air base in our town was bumped out. The railroad was bumped out. The railroad station was bumped out. And they needed us. So they wanted us to stay. One Jewish fellow by the name of Srilik Palant from our town, who was with us, he then went eastward across the San River to the area that was then ceded by Hitler to the Soviets. He actually survived the war in Siberia. He just died about 2 years ago in Israel. I had visited him there, and he told me the story of his ordeal. So now we were in our town. Things remained quiet in our town, other than that a Judenrat was established, a committee of Jewish elders called Judenrat, and they were supposed to fulfill all the orders of the Gestapo. Namely, they had to deliver Jews to clean the streets and to do all kinds of menial work and so on. We were exempted because we were very busy doing work for the Germans. Their armies, their trucks needed glazing, they had broken windows, they needed framing, they needed all kinds of work. So we were actually exempted from doing this type of work, except in the winter when there was a shortage of workers. My father and I, especially on a Sunday when the shop was closed, were sent out to clean the roads of snow and things of that sort. But every Jew in our town, and there were about 2,000 plus of us, was still alive at that time. No one was killed. Polish patriots had been taken away and never heard of again, presumably executed. Well, things were relatively quiet in our town, so much so that some of the Jewish people had managed to escape to the Soviet part of Poland smuggled back to our town because they would rather stay under German occupation as long as there was no killing than be under the Soviets in a strange city. Well, two of my cousins came back that way, first cousins from the Soviet area. 1939 and 1940 was relatively quiet. There were tremendous hardships, and I'm not going to dwell on it. It was hard to get food. The Jewish population in our town swelled with refugees from Western Poland, which was annexed to Germany, and the Jews had to leave. So many of them came to our town, and we had to accommodate them. The Jewish community had to provide them with a place to live, with food, and it was extremely difficult. But we all still survived. Schools were closed, not just for Jews, but also for Poles. So we tried to live as best as we could a normal life. Teachers would come to your house to teach you, and we would have a minyan in a private home to pray on the Sabbath, and for Easter we even baked matzah. So even though it was extremely difficult, we survived. In 1940, as you know, with the Allies in the West sitting around with the phony war, Hitler decided to move his armies from Poland, from the east to the west, and attack the Allies, which he did. And of course, to make a long story short, as you know, within 5 weeks, France was gone, Belgium, Holland, later on the Scandinavian, the Baltic countries, the Scandinavian countries, I'm sorry, Denmark and Norway, and so on. And the Germans were at the zenith of their power. They ate it up. I had quite a bit of contact with German soldiers and officers who used to come to our shop. I spoke to them freely, and they were actually very nice. They gave us tips. Sometimes they would give us a loaf or two of Kommissbrot, which was German military bread. They would exchange German marks for Polish zlotys, which I could then sell to a Jewish trader for double. So we survived, and we were left alone. Here and there, sporadically, the Gestapo shot a Jew or a couple of Jews. And I remember one instance where a Jew was caught without the armband, a few Jews actually, and they were shot. And I remember my father being a member of the Judenrat and part of the social services of the Jewish community, was telling us that the Ortskommandant, which is the regional military German commander, had called Mr. Engel, who was the head of the Judenrat, to his office and wanted to know what had transpired. He heard that Jews were killed. And Mr. Engel told him, and he expressed his condolences to the families, and he told Mr. Engel to tell the Jews that we are not all like this. And he regrets what had happened, but he has no power over the Gestapo. Now, this was a remarkable statement by a German colonel who was the military commander. Of course, we know today that some generals, like General Blaskowitz, protested the treatment of Jews and Poles by the SS, but he got nowhere with it. And so went by 1939, 1940. In 1941, around springtime, we have noticed tremendous movement of German troops from the west toward the San and the Bug rivers, the demarcation line between the Soviet part of Poland and the German part of Poland. We knew something was going to happen. Day and night, there was traffic moving eastward. And there was graffiti on the trains, such as, for example, the russische Schwein verlangt, was es nicht sein. That means the Russian pig wants what isn't his. Reference probably to him wanting all the Baltic countries and and the Bukovina and Bessarabia that was part of Romania. We knew something was going to happen. And then June 22nd, early, very early in the morning, the radio of a German who lived next to our building was blaring martial music and announcing the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which means the supreme command of the German army, marched into Soviet territory. There was lots of air traffic in our town because we had a military air base which was just built before the war by the Poles. And within few hours, some of the airmen came into our shop for usual things that they used to come in, like framing and so on, and described their sorties in the east. I remember they described having flown, bombing Lemberg, which is called Lwów in Polish, or Lviv in Ukrainian. It's now the Ukraine, the capital of Western Ukraine. And they described how the Soviets were surprised, and they were running out in their gachas, that means in their shorts, and their underwear, out of their places. Anyway, as you know from the history, that the Germans moved rapidly, very rapidly, through the Soviet half of Poland, and by about mid-December they were already in the suburbs of Moscow. Quite a feat, considering the roads in the Soviet Union, which were not highways like they were in Germany or like they are in the United States. They surrounded Leningrad, and they were moving very rapidly forward. Now, some returnees from the east that came back into our town, Jewish returnees, described the horrors that the Sonderkommandos, so special commands I mentioned before, did in the eastern territories. They took Jews out by the tens of thousands in the different cities and were machine gunning them in the different towns. In Stanislavov, a town, my cousin told us that about 10,000 Jews were shot. Now, we know today that at Babi Yar near Kiev, some 40,000 Jews were shot. And if one reads some of the secret reports of the Sonderkommandos to their supreme commands about their achievements, you will see in this town we killed so many, in this town so many, total 99,000. During the Nuremberg trials, one of the head of these commandos was asked how many Jews his command killed. He said approximately 150,000. So Jews were massacred left and right over there. But where we were, which was part of the German-occupied Poland, this did not occur. Anyway, around mid-December, the Russian winter stopped the German armies from moving forward. They were not prepared for the winters because Hitler thought that by Christmas Stalin will be a goner and the Ukrainians are going to join Hitler's armies, as will the Baltic countries, who hated the Soviets, but that was not to occur. So now the German army was left without winter clothing. So my father, being a member of the Jewish community elders, was called up with all the others to the Gestapo. And I remember that evening. It was an evening. My father said goodbye to us. He went up to the Gestapo there, and we didn't know what was going to happen there. And I remember having seen him through the window, standing with his head to the window at the Gestapo. After about a half an hour there, he came back with an order that Jews have to deliver all their woolens, all their furs to a certain place within 24 hours, and whoever would be caught with any of that around will be shot on the spot. My father told us that he overheard one of the Gestapo chiefs from a neighboring town, who were there too. He told the Gestapo chief in our town, Hauptsturmführer Schmatzler, he told him, knallen Sie einige weg. That means, knock a few off. When the head of the Jewish community elders, Mr. Engel, asked a question, he was hit in the face and they were dismissed. So now we took all our wounds that we had, we took whatever furs we had. Of course, we didn't have much of that stuff. Sure, we had torn woolen stockings, because in those days you weren't buying new stockings like you buy here. If you had a hole in the socks, you mended it. We took everything and delivered it as ordered. And indeed, the following day, a few Jewish people were shot under the pretext that they were caught with a glove or a shawl or something of that sort. Of course, that wasn't true. So this was my second experience of atrocities, with the first one being right as they marched into the town of Dinov. And so 1942 came. Early February 1942, a German came into our shop. He used to buy glass for the air base. He used to work there. And he came in, he wanted to speak to my father in private. So my father went out with him and spoke with him. What he told my father is that he is Jewish, but he didn't wear an armband, so he couldn't be sure that he's Jewish, and that he is from Gleiwitz, a German town, which is now Poland, by the way, and that he has heard from very reliable authority that the order from Himmler is out that by the end of 1942 there is not to be a single Jew alive. Now my father, and what he wanted my father to do, since we knew everybody in our town and the surrounding villages just about, to find a hiding place, and he would like to join us in that hiding place. I remember my father told us this, but we did not believe him. How can you kill millions of people? You can shoot 100,000, 200,000, but how can you kill millions? We did nothing. Now, just about that time, rumors came out that in the city of Chelm, apparently the Germans, the SS, had hermetically sealed trucks where they would load the Jewish people in there and drive the carbon monoxide into the truck, drive them from the assembly point to the point of burial, and by the time they would arrive there, they would be dead, poisoned and suffocated. We heard these rumors, but I remember the Jewish community elders told us not to spread these rumors because it would just cause panic, and we don't know whether it is true or it isn't true. Of course, now we know that that was true, but we didn't want to believe it. Around May of 1942, the order came to establish a ghetto. Now, the Jews in our town, the number of Jews, had swollen to over 4,000 from only 2,000 some before, because Jews from the surrounding villages were ordered to leave everything and move into the ghetto. And also people from the territories annexed to Germany in the west were chased out of there, and we had to accommodate them in our town. So they were all here. Now, it was very difficult to feed all these people. it was very difficult to house them. My father, being in the social services, on the social services committee, tried the best that they could. First, they provided 2 meals a day to all these people. Then 1 meal a day. And you had to buy much of it on the black market because the rations for Jews were only a couple of 100 calories a day. For Poles, they were a little more than double that. So many of these things have to be bought on the black market, and it was extremely difficult. Then, the end of July 1942, the order came that Jews are going to be resettled to the east. Of course, we know that resettlement meant sending them to the gas chambers. We know that today. We didn't know then what's going to happen to those people. Although there were rumors that there was Treblinka with gas chambers and people from Warsaw were being sent over there. And there was a faint rumor that there was an extermination camp in Belzec, which is east of us, of Krosno, and that people were being gassed there. But it was difficult to believe. It was difficult to comprehend that you can take people and just gas them and kill them. So the day came that we all were ordered to show up at the cattle market near the railroad station, which was a large plaza called in Polish Targowica. We have to show up there one Monday by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And everybody has to show up there. The sick, the healthy, the babies, everybody.